All right, so here what I want to do is just take a brief look or introduce you to what is sometimes referred to as the social science approach within exegeting a text, or also kind of involved with sociological interpretations of biblical text. So the sociological interpretations, what they attempt to do is use sociological and anthropological theories to recreate or to try to understand the social dynamics that led to the production of our biblical text. So, for instance, if a sociologist might be able to discern characteristics of a peasant revolt. So, when the lower classes um, rise, under what conditions do they rise, and what methods are used in the uprising, what are the motivations, and so how do they communicate. So in a sociological approach to the biblical text, they want to understand the biblical authors in some ways resisting, as it were, forces that are at play and seeking to contest them or to undermine them, to resist them in some way. And so, how was the Jesus movement um, akin to a peasant revolt? Or how do the biblical authors write with some of the same kind of motivations that seems to occur when these types of movements or activities occur later on throughout history? Another example here that I have is the millenarian movement. So sociologists might describe certain groups as millenarian, meaning they think that they're ushering in a new dawn, a new age, a new world, as it were, and they have certain characteristic about how the current world is going to implode, how the current age is going to come to an end, and how they oftentimes center around a key figure, a spokesperson. They have these kinds of familial relationships. They see themselves in a kind of a tight knit group. And so, because they've identified certain groups throughout history as millenarian, um, they then project back upon the New Testament period and early Christianities and try to characterize or see how much of that group fits what's occurring in these other later groups. So these are kind of illustrations of taking models that exist amongst sociologists and seeing how those models might help to interpret the movements behind the production of biblical text. So there have been developments in the sociological interpretations, not only of cultures generally, but also specifically of the New Testament and even the Old Testament, or the authors of these texts. Early on, amongst biblical scholars, we see people like Adolf Deisman in 1911 and Ernst Troelix. Max Weber is a very important one as well. Shaler Matthews, Shirley Jackson Case. So these are some of the early pioneers in trying to think sociologically about what is taking place. More recently, we've seen people like Norman Gottwald with the Old Testament. We see E.A. Judge, John Gager, John Eliot, Wayne Meeks, Garrett Thiessen. So these would be people who are applying these approaches to the New Testament text. So let's get here with kind of a definition of the social science criticism, as it's sometimes referred to. So basically, social science criticism of the Bible is that phase of the exegetical task which analyzes the social and cultural dimensions of the text and of its environmental context through the utilization of perspectives, theory, model, and research of the social sciences. So, reading what social scientists are doing with other cultures and seeing how those may be applicable or helpful in describing the situations of the biblical authors. As a component of the historical critical method of exegesis, social scientific criticism investigates biblical texts as meaningful configurations of language intended to communicate between composers and audiences. So, what is it that these authors are doing as they are communicating to their audience? And what are some of the assumptions about the world in which they live in and about each other and um, the reality, as it were, of their relationships, not only with inside but also outside. So this definition is provided by John Eliot in a little work that he's done called "What is Social Scientific Criticism?" So the sociological interpretations really have three major models. There's a kind of a structuralist, functionalist approach model, and it views traditions as integrated wholes. So different parts of ideas are connected to other things, and seeks what influences the movements behind these traditions. So when we see a biblical author utilizing information, what's going on when they utilize that information. So, for example, if you see Paul using a creed in a letter, you might ask then about the nature of creeds in defining communities and how they function within communities and what it says about the community to have the thing. What kinds of groups create these type of material and utilize these materials? And so how does that then kind of connect, as it were, to the theology that Paul is espousing for that kind of group who uses those kinds of material? So sometimes they look at conflict, examining the issues of power and politics and the pressures they place upon social groups. So again, I want to talk about Paul. So Paul is a person who believes he has authority. And where does this authority come from? How does he exercise that authority over the people that he writes to? How does he utilize power in positions? How does he understand what powers are at play? So there can be powers inside the community, and there are powers outside of the community. So in one sense, the community might be powerless. In the larger community, they might be marginalized, or some of the individuals might be participating in those powers. So you think of 1 Corinthians, Paul seems to know or reflect that there are Christians who may be utilizing courts. So courts are generally utilized by people of power. Sometimes they were used by people of power against those who are more powerless. And so Paul recognizes Christians are using the courts against each other. And so, he's exercising, as it were, his authority, his power as an apostle, maybe even as a person who helped uh, find or found or establish the church there and some kind of allegiance that these people ought to have to him. And so a sociological interpretation is going to look at the power plays that are at work within this community and in Paul's teachings and what he's trying to do to those Corinthians or to whomever in these situations. Sometimes as well symbolic, so it examines the value that is placed by a society on people, things, and events. So, of course, for early Christians, what things do they value? So, of course, an ultimate value came to be, particularly in the Pauline material, is the crucifixion of Christ. And so, how does this symbol of the crucifixion of Jesus, how is that at work? What is this like? How did other groups utilize symbols in order to create a community or create cohesion, create influence? So how is Paul using those symbols? Symbols like baptism and symbols like prayer. I mean, these are things that help to define a group of people, activities that people are engaged in. Communion might be another one that a sociological approach will try to understand these kinds of activities. What do they mean for people at that time? So different models that are at use. So there are some weaknesses we need to be aware of if we're going to use it. And no one really wants to say that one model is the only model that's used. So there are people who are advocating a social scientific approach, and we can learn from those. We can take what we think is valuable and helpful, but we're certainly not going to, that's not going to be the only approach that is used. There's lots of different criticisms and disciplines that are employed in the exegetical process. But when we're going to take advantage or utilize a social scientific approach to the biblical text, we need to be aware of certain weaknesses. So oftentimes this approach assumes things where the data doesn't provide evidence. So it might assume that people in a particular world would act or believe or think certain things because people assumed or acted or believed things at a much later time. So, and there may not be any evidence that the people we're dealing with in biblical periods believe these things, but this kind of assumption that they probably, because they are people, and if there is this kind of history of people behaving in this way, to assume that people in ancient times operated in these ways as well. So for that reason, it's really vulnerable to anachronism. So by anachronism, thinking that because people think this way in later times, we can retroject them back to ancient times. And so you really have to be quite sensitive to making sure that you're not just assuming that people in biblical times hold the same values or ideals or worldviews as people of a later time. Be careful with that. Oftentimes it has a revisionist presupposition. In other words, a sociological interpretation believes that what is presented to us as life in ancient times is inadequate, inaccurate, and it needs to be revised. And so the sociological perspective begins, as it were, what's not being said, what's being missed, how does this information, how does it need to be recast? So it presumes that that's what has to take place. There are oftentimes overgeneralizations, reductionisms, in other words, thinking about all people are like this, or reducing whole groups of people. We hear this very oftentimes with people use the expression, the Jews believed. So that's very reductionistic, as if all Jews believed certain things. Well, Jews, there are lots of different kinds of Jews in the first centuries, and they have lots of different views. And so Some of them would be quite far apart from each other. So to talk about all or every, the Romans were, these are big generalizations. Sometimes generalizations are helpful when you just need to create a kind of a canvas, an overall canvas for what you're investigating. But you do have to be cautious or careful to watch out for these generalizations where you cast groups of people or activities or views with one broad stroke and don't reflect an understanding that there are people with different ideas and views. Overly speculative, so it's dealing because it oftentimes deal with lack of evidence, that are trying to fill in gaps where the biblical material is quiet or silent. It can be overly speculative. And it's dismissive of the reality of divine intervention or spiritual experiences. Again, theology and sociology really converse with each other. I believe it was John Milbank, who basically thought that sociology and theology were, two different disciplines and can't really converse with each other. Theology is going to make these claims about God and what God is doing in the world and God's authority and power over human beings and controlling human individuals, whereas sociology is going just to take God out of the picture, as it were, and just look at human beings. Human beings will use God, will cite God or claim God in order to exert power over people. So that can be a problem, especially for confessing scholars as they are dealing with biblical texts who believe that God has intervened within human history, that God does communicate his will or makes his will known, that there is this will to be made known, and that the biblical authors are somehow or another connected to that divine revelation, which they are then passing on to their readers, their audiences. So how to use the discipline? So finally, I'll leave it with this. Use, first of all, the grammatical historical approach first. So find out what you can about the words that are used, how words were used, people, places, events, geography you want to learn about, topography you want to learn about. So anything that you can discover from the evidence that exists about life in these ancient times and about words and how words were used at that time. You want to try and collect all the data because we can sometimes space out. And of course, this can be difficult. Who knows that they collect all the data and making the choice whether or not all the data is relevant. But you're attempting to collect as much information that you can and then trying to synthesize all that information. And you're going to allow the text to control the interpretation rather than theory, because sometimes in some sociological interpretations, they have a theory, a model, and they're wedded to that model. And then as they read these texts are really read in sometimes strained ways in order that the information will fit the model. So instead, you really need to allow the evidence of what's in the text to direct how you're understanding and treating the text. And then finally, I'll just say that what you want to do is try and compare multiple theories. So we have the sociological interpretation, social science approach, but look at other approaches as well. Look at other models that exist, even amongst the social scientific approaches. There are different theories. And so be cautious about reading one particular author who represents one particular theory and seeing their conclusions about what a text reveals about the author and the audience, and what influences there are at place in the world upon them because there are other theories that can make persuasive um, arguments about what is going on. So try to compare multiple theories, and then which one makes the most sense to you, the one that seems to answer the most questions, that has the least amount of weaknesses as far as you're concerned. Then you can move towards that one. All right, we'll leave the sociological interpretations then as an illustration of the uh, historical, cultural context and ways of approaching the text in order to determine what an author is trying to communicate to his audience.